A lot of people think that the system is so corrupt and is so guilty that there's no comparison to the guilt or corruption of somebody like Donald Trump, right? That the problem is just that the underlying pre-existing way that we do democracy in the United States is so far gone that we need a bomb thrower like Donald Trump to shake things up. And that temptation is always going to be there. And I really wonder sort of about how we can change that. Do we need a radical institutional reform after Trump is out of office, a real coming together? Is that ever likely to happen? How do we make people less hostile to political elites and to the institutions we have? Because if they remain as angry as they are, and honestly, in some ways, for good reason, they are angry, we'll surely always live with the danger of somebody like Trump coming back in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's sort of two angles to this. One is in terms of what his base would sort of be demanding of the system. What's surprising to me, I mean, I'm from Minnesota, it's a solidly Democratic state, but it inched closer to voting for Trump. It's got parts of it that are sort of like the Rust Belt, the Iron Range, and the mining Northeast, et cetera, where Trump performed very well. And I think a lot of those people are not expecting him to deliver anything for them. They're just sort of sticking it to the establishment, which has failed to provide for them for the last 3 decades. And this is where the point that you made about this being a legitimate concern, I think, is a very legitimate concern, is that the average sort of American worker is not getting a wage increase for decades. The middle class has not been riding the wave of globalization that a lot of the developing world has, and also the rich in the United States. And I think that's the answer. I mean, I think that's really the answer, is that a lot of people are pretty happy with the establishment when the system is providing some basic functions, like the idea that when you work hard, you will have a safe pension, you'll have the dignity of work that pays more each year after the next, and that there's sort of these things that are part and parcel of the American dream, no matter how much of a myth it was before, that I think a lot of people feel like they have lost. And this is where Make America Great Again is, I mean, frankly, a brilliant campaign slogan, because it is this sense of nostalgia for sort of the white working class that, you showed up to the steel mill and you were never going to get, the spotlight for it. You were never going to get praise for it, but you'd have a decent life. And I think that's the real answer, is that the establishment has genuinely abandoned those people. They have not provided policies that cater to them. And I also think that the real tragedy of Trump is that he's not actually speaking to the problem that they're confronting, which is automation. And that's going to intensify significantly. We're going to have a real test case of whether politicians, sort of the Trump 2.0s, can get the same mileage railing against robots and machines as they can against, Muslims and Mexicans. But that's going to be the next stage of politics, because that's the reality is that all of these manufacturing jobs are going to disappear as a result of computerization and robots. I mean, if automated cars and automated trucks take the road, that's a whole nother industry that's going to be decimated. This isn't revolutionary. This is something where you can see it coming. It's not some sort of massive prediction. It's a slow burn. And so my take on this is that, the Democrats got a wake-up call, just as the Republicans did. But the Republicans are making, in my view, a catastrophic long-term mistake, in that they're doubling down on policies that created the inequality that's driving Trumpism in the first place. And it's very easy to see how, in a system where there's no wage increases for decades for the average worker, how you turn to scapegoating, nationalism, and the rise of an outsider. So
I have a question about this, because this is part of my story as well, right? So I have a book, which I finished a draft of a couple months ago, which will be out early in 2018. And one of the arguments I'm making is that a structural driver of this populist rage is the stagnation of living standards from one generation to the next. One way in which I'm interested in your work is to look beyond the context of North America and Western Europe. And there the story becomes more complicated. The Polish economy has increased 6-fold since 1990. The wages of average people really have gone up, right? Whereas in the States, it's easy to say, does the average American have a better life today than 25, 30 years ago? Not so clear. In some ways, yes. In other ways, no. In Poland, it's just clear that people have better lives today. The vast majority of Poles have better life today than they had 25 or 30 years ago. And yet you see the rise of a surprisingly similar set of populist attitudes in politicians. And so how do we explain that? Why is it that when you look beyond the context of North America and Western Europe, where the stagnation story is not true, you also see these populists rising.
Well, I think that's where there's sort of this cultural nostalgia. I mean, I think in places like Poland and Hungary, that's where the xenophobic nationalism resonates even more strongly than the economic nationalism. So, the places that I've done a lot of work, places like Belarus and Thailand and Madagascar and Tunisia, the economic story actually goes a pretty long way because they're not dealing with a massive influx of immigrants. There's a backlash against establishment politics that fails to deliver. In places in Eastern Europe that actually rode the wave of globalization, you do see, Viktor Orban's, populism is much more rooted in this sort of cultural nostalgia that is, it's effectively white nationalism packaged as something a little bit more savory, but only vaguely packaged, beyond that.
But if that resonates so much there, and you look at something like Trump, who has both the cultural nationalist and the economic nationalist element, isn't that a suggestion that perhaps the cultural nationalist element is more important in his appeal than his economic nationalist elements?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, I think it depends who you're talking to, right? I mean, I think some of the cultural nationalism would resonate extremely strongly with affluent people in Alabama, for example, right? But maybe not as much with urban New Yorkers. But the economic nationalism with the taxi driver in New York might resonate quite strongly. I think the 1-2 punch that he brings is essential for a country as diverse culturally and economically as the United States, whereas in a place like Poland or Hungary, you have more of a homogenous society, right?
That's interesting. So the idea is that in a place that's pretty homogeneous and that feels that homogeneity being threatened, the cultural nationalism is sort of enough. And that's because there's enough people who share in one culture for appeals to that to carry a real winning coalition. Whereas in the United States, there are certainly people like that who you can reach, but you're not going to get to a majority. In order to get to a majority, you have to add people on top of that who perhaps aren't completely averse to that cultural nationalism, but who are activated by the economic side.
Absolutely. And this is where, the scariest moment to me of Trump's administration so far is not one that a lot of people would think of. And it's the speech he gave to Congress. Because I listened to that speech and I was like, this is how you package Trump that resonates with economic nationalism and cultural nationalism, but doesn't alienate the people who are alienated by Trump. Because the dirty secret here in Washington and around the sort of political elites in the United States is many people realize that what Trump is talking about is genuinely popular in some ways, right? The idea of scapegoating Muslims, the idea of jailing illegal immigrants, et cetera, even for minor crimes, those are genuinely popular things. It's an ugly truth, but I think it's true. So what you have to think about if you're sort of the Trump 2.0 is how do you say those things in the softer way, right? The way that doesn't get wrapped up with all of the crude misogyny, all of the, we're going to ban Muslims outright, but sort of speaks in code, which is something, by the way, that United States politicians are very good at to activate latent racism and bigotry in sort of coded words. This is sort of, the George H.W. Bush ad about Willie Horton in 1988, right, with insinuating that Michael Dukakis was soft on crime because he was going to let this black killer out of jail. And it's not overt, but it's still extremely powerful. And so, that speech that he gave to Congress wasn't particularly eloquent, but it packaged things in a way that didn't have the sort of rough edges of Trump. And that's where I was really terrified that he was going to get packaged by his advisors.
And what you found scary is that it actually seemed to move the needle, that people actually were responding to it quite positively.
Exactly. I mean, this is the thing is the 2 days of his administration where I think he's been happy because he's been applauded have been that speech and bombing Syria, which is why I am very worried because, he's a guy who wants praise. We're talking about democracy and he's tweeted about crowds 247 times, but about human rights once, and that was just to mock them. And then you have him embattled, back up against the wall in domestic politics. And the happy moments of his presidency are the speech and the bombing Syria. And the worry I have is that the lesson he'll learn over time is to just listen to his advisors, which would make Trumpism actually much more sinister, or to lash out with military might in a way that receives praise and has the Fareed Zakarias of the world saying he just became president tonight.